There are many reasons that The Witcher 3 continues to be called one of the greatest video games of all time. From its enjoyable and flexible combat system, with options to play Geralt as everything from a damage tank, to a fleet-footed duelist, and even a spell sword, to its reimagining of fairy tales, as shown by the Crones of Crookback Bog and Gaunter O'Dim, or its brilliant quest and narrative design, where characters like the Bloody Baron and Olgierd von Everick force players to view the world in shades of grey. There's just so much to like about it, and so many things that earn it consistent praise from fans and critics alike. But no game is without sin, and unfortunately, one thing that folks consistently cite as one of The Witcher 3's few flaws is its primary antagonist, Eredin, King of the Wild Hunt. Though he is certainly imposing and boasts a pretty cool character design, Eredin is largely an afterthought throughout our journey, and overshadowed by almost every one of the regional villains and those who take up leading roles in the DLC. Radovid, Dietlaf, the aforementioned Ladies of the Wood, and Master Mirror are better antagonists than him, with stories that produce far more memorable reactions from the player. For Eredin, it is, ironically, the fact that he, despite serving as the final boss of the base game, is so forgettable in a game full of unforgettable moments that makes him memorable, and an important topic for analysis and critical conversations around this all-time great game. Though I will certainly contend that the King of the Wild Hunt could have been portrayed better, I don't believe that doing so is necessary, nor do I believe that it would have improved the game all that much. As disappointing a primary antagonist as he is, Eredin ultimately serves his purpose, because he's best viewed not as a true villain, but the ultimate monster in a game about a monster hunter. A cold, unfeeling entity that has more in common with your average Catacan than any of his contemporaries. A monster who reacts to the actions of others rather than takes initiative on his own. An inevitability that cannot see beyond his singular goal, and forces Geralt to protect the people closest to him and become a better father to his adopted daughter. But before I go on, if you are a Witcher fan, then please be sure to like, subscribe, and consider supporting me with a YouTube channel membership or over on Patreon. My dream is to make these videos full-time someday, and by doing any of those things, you'll be helping make that dream a reality. Eredin's first appearance is actually quite effective. He appears at the end of Geralt's dream, which, as I've discussed in other videos, is all about showing the player what Geralt values the most. It establishes him as a family man, who, at the end of the day, wants nothing more than to live the simple life with his goofy dad uncle, the sorceress of his choice, and his adopted daughter. So naturally, any good antagonist will need to be a person capable of taking all of those things away from him. That's the role this dream puts Eredin in, as he shows up on the Naglfar, freezes everyone except for the White Wolf, and then raises his blade to strike Ciri. All in all, a pretty strong opening. Like a horror movie villain, we don't see his face, or even know anything about his motives at this point. Just that he's a bad dude out to do bad things to the people Geralt cares about the most. And honestly, that's enough for this early in the narrative, and hardly the point where the game begins to struggle with Eredin. Though Eredin doesn't appear again during the prologue, his Wild Hunt riders do. They chase Geralt and Yennefer out of White Orchard on their way to Vizima, which essentially serves to do the same thing as the dream, to present Eredin and his boys as a threat to Geralt's loved ones, in this case Yennefer. The difference here, of course, is that it takes that threat, which had been previously confined to Geralt's imagination, and brings it into reality. On its own, this is altogether effective as well. But the problem is that it presents the Wild Hunt as something they really aren't, an active villain. Generally speaking, when the Wild Hunt takes action in The Witcher 3, it's always part of their pursuit of Ciri. They're either hunting her down directly, as we see in the memory segments, following the trails of people who have actually been with her, or targeting those few people who have concrete information about her. Attacking Geralt and Yennefer is none of those things. All they have at this point are a few vague leads, all of which the Wild Hunt already knows about. The Wild Hunt might think that the White Wolf and the raven-haired sorceress know where she's at, but if so, you'd think they'd have gone after them more than just this one time. The same is true if their plan was to capture them and use them as bait to draw Ciri out of hiding. I suspect that the latter was their intention, but still, for this to be the only instance where they directly attack our protagonist up until the Battle of Kaer Morhen is rather odd. So while this segment certainly works narratively, as it shows us that the threat from Geralt's dream is indeed real, it sort of sets them up for trouble later. It makes Eredin and his entourage look like ruthless, calculating villains who will be pursuing Geralt at every step of his journey, which just isn't the case. Eredin's next appearance, interestingly enough, continues this trend. After Geralt has met with Yennefer, he can go to Velen, where he'll eventually visit the village of Heatherton. Decimated by the hunt before he arrived, a survivor will tell the White Wolf about how Eredin ruthlessly tortured Hendrik, the Emperor's spy. Once more, it presents the King of the Wild Hunt, and by extension, his men, as active villains. As we watch Hendrik suffer Eredin's wrath, we can't help but worry for Ciri, and anyone who might have crossed paths with her. No doubt, Witcher veterans were concerned for folks like Dandelion and Zoltan at this point in the story. It doesn't matter that Hendrik carried his secrets to his grave, that Eredin essentially failed in his mission. The fact that the King of the Wild Hunt put an entire town to the sword and brutalized a dude just for a few scraps of information is enough to present him as an imposing antagonist. Eredin himself doesn't show up again for a very long time, but the hunt does make 2 appearances on their own, during the quest where Geralt explores Avlok's lab with Kira Metz, and during the series' story segment in Crookback Bog, the one provided to the White Wolf through his conversation with the crones. Starting with the underground trek with Kira, it again shows that the Wild Hunt can be powerful enemies, particularly from a gameplay perspective. On my Death March run last summer, I actually had so much trouble with the hunt here that I needed to reload to an earlier save and level up before I could take them down. But even if you're not out to max out your achievements like me, the frost spells from the Hunt's Warlock are a pain to deal with on just about any difficulty, and Nithral is a strong early game roadblock that effectively tests how well the player has learned to fight like a Witcher. He's a bit like the Genichiro of this game. And in terms of story, they're doing what we'd expect an active villain to do, continuing to try and pick up on Ciri's trail. Honestly, it's yet another solid appearance by Eredin's boys. As for Ciri's story in Crookback Bog, only Imlerith shows up for this one, along with a pack of hounds. Narratively, it establishes a connection between the hunt and the crones, which will become rather important later on. In terms of gameplay, it's not bad either. The hounds just keep coming, which forces Ciri into a situation where she really has no choice but to run. It strongly sells the forces and infrastructure the hunt has at their disposal, that it will take allies to defeat them, another point that will come up in the 3rd act. In terms of appearances by Eredin and the hunt, that's it for Velen, and looking back at them, I have to say that they're all, generally speaking, pretty damn good. Even if every one of them isn't something to write home about, they effectively remind us of their presence and power. Considering their positioning as 3rd act antagonists at the bookend of story, coupled with how long The Witcher 3 is, and how many gripping characters we meet in Velen, from the Bloody Baron to the crones, these recurring appearances were necessary to keep them in the back of our minds. Honestly, though there's already so much to praise about Velen, the developer's best achievement in this region might be the way they balanced all-time quests like Family Matters and the return to Crookback Bog with building up the Wild Hunt for the end of the game. It's really impressive, especially when you consider the fact that it's something that really only Velen manages to do. Because unfortunately, once we leave this war-torn hellscape, Eredin largely disappears from the game. The Wild Hunt doesn't appear at all in Novigrad, unless you count the Witcher contract that ends with you fighting one of their hounds. Though not as dense as Velen, Novigrad still represents a huge portion of the game, 10 plus hours where you don't hear anything about the game's primary antagonist nor his forces. And while I certainly feel that Geralt's trek through the Free City is strong enough on its own, it's here that the absence of the Hunt and their king really sets in, which does feed into the criticism folks have levied about them. By contrast, their appearance in the Skellige chapter of Ciri's story is much better, an effective fastball down the middle after failing to paint the outside corners. It's revealed that when Ciri returned to the continent, she first arrived on Ard Skellig, where the Hunt attacked both her and Avallac'h. During the fighting, she was injured, forcing her to flee through a portal to Velen, which resulted in her crossing paths with the Crones, as we saw earlier. Later, after being wounded in Novigrad, she reunited with Avallac'h and returned to Skellige, to the village of Lofoten, where Skjall nursed her back to health. But the Wild Hunt would soon descend again, plunging the settlement into a blizzard and slaughtering every man in the area, save Skjall. Eredin doesn't appear, but there's nothing wrong with that. He's the leader and the big bad. There's no need for him to overexpose himself. Regardless, it's here that CD Projekt Red seems to have figured out what they actually want to do with the King of the Wild Hunt and his underlings. As mentioned earlier, back in Velen, it seemed that the developers were trying to position Eredin and the Wild Hunt as active villains. Bad guys who would be hounding us throughout our adventure and targeting anyone who might have information on Ciri. Gangsters determined to squeeze those closest to her into giving up her location. But here in Lofoten, they become less of a character and more of a monster. An inevitability that's less concerned with finessing their way to capturing her and will instead be following her every footstep, putting both the ashen-haired girl and anyone she dares associate with in tremendous danger. No matter where she goes, no matter what she does, Eredin and his hunt will always be there. Like the creatures Geralt hunts for coin, he is reactive instead of proactive, responding to the moves of his prey based on instinct alone. Understanding this transformation is critical to interpreting their late-game role. It seems that at this point in development, CD Projekt Red realized that there wasn't going to be a way to make the King of the Wild Hunt and his lackeys as well-drawn characters as the Bloody Baron and the Crones, and thus opted to take a different approach in their presentation. To me, it mitigates some of the criticisms of them. We'll talk more about why I feel that way later on. In any case, this fresh reminder of how dangerous the Hunt is carries Geralt through the rest of Skellige, which is noticeably shorter than both Velen and Novigrad, and all the way through to the similarly brief Kaer Morhen chapter, until at last, the player arrives at the Isle of Mists. After an emotional reunion with Ciri, the Wild Hunt shows up right away. This reinforces their presentation as more of a monster, an inevitability. All Ciri did was wake up, and there they are, ready to do whatever it takes to capture her. Not unlike a catachan Geralt might accept a contract on, Eredin's actions are always responses to the movements of others. From there, we're thrust into what is, without a doubt, one of the best segments of the game, the Battle of Kaer Morhen. I'll be breaking down this quest itself at some point, but throughout it, the Wild Hunt are shown to be very capable enemies that test the mettle of the Witcher Avengers that Geralt gathered to protect the keep. Once the defenders are pushed beyond the inner walls, Eredin at long last returns to the scene. Flanked by his lieutenants, Imlerith and Caranthir, he surrounds Ciri and has Imlerith pin Vesemir to the wall in an attempt to coerce the ashen-haired girl into surrendering. It's a powerful moment that harkens back to the mobster-like style we saw from him earlier, back when he tortured Hendrik. And to his credit, it almost works. But Vesemir has no intention of going gentle into that good night, and as he attempts to rave and burn at close of day, forces the big muscle of the Wild Hunt to kill him. Whether or not this was the old Witcher's plan, whether he knew how Ciri would respond, is something I'll tackle when the Elder Statesman of Kaer Morhen gets his own video down the line. Regardless, Eredin's reaction here, or lack thereof, is interesting. Vesemir was going to die anyway. That much is obvious. And while it's true that the old Witcher forced Imlerith's hand, for him to die at that exact moment, as Ciri is about to surrender, is counterintuitive to Eredin's plan, because it removes all of his leverage. One would think that he'd respond to this by perhaps chastising Imlerith, but instead, he puts on his mask and orders his men to take the ashen-haired girl by force. This sudden shift in planning doesn't make much sense, unless you consider his earlier words about how humans are impractical. He says it with such a cold, alien-like tonality that it really emphasizes just how unfeeling he is, how the twists and turns of mortal emotions don't make any sense to him at all. So of course he has no reaction to losing his leverage, and instead simply moves on to another way to capture his target. Because again, at this point in the narrative, Eredin isn't a villain. He's a monster. An inevitability. He has no emotions, no feelings to speak of, only his steadfast determination to capture Ciri. But unfortunately for Eredin, even monsters need to be taken seriously. Overcome with rage at Vesemir's death, Ciri unleashes a sonic scream that forces the King of the Wild Hunt to flee. Or, to be more exact, forces Caranthir to pull Eredin away from being shouted to death. For Ciri, it's a great character moment that emphasizes her power and importance more than any other that we've seen to this point in the game. But for Eredin, it's something of a kneecapping from which he'll never recover. He remains the big bad, but his threat level is significantly diminished. We know that he can't stop Ciri on his own, so how is he going to contend with Geralt in the event he escapes getting turned into a popsicle? As The Witcher 3 enters its final act, the developers begin to set the stage for a final confrontation with Eredin, while also adding in some sprinklings of character development for him. We learn that Eredin has, in Avallac'h's words, succumbed to his fear of the White Frost. The White Frost, of course, is the inevitable end of all worlds, when all life is consumed by ice and cold. It's for this reason that he hunts Ciri as ferociously as he does. He knows that the White Frost is coming for his world, and knows that in order to transport all of his people somewhere else, he'll need Ciri's magic, her ability to travel between worlds. It's a strong motivation, and though some might argue that it humanizes him somewhat, I feel that what it really does is continue to present him as a monster. If we'd seen him come to this realization firsthand, and grapple with the fact that the end of his people and his civilization was fast approaching, then it would certainly present him in a more sympathetic light. But the fact that the game does not allow us to experience the source of Eredin's motivations like this suggests that the developers don't really have any interest in painting him as a more nuanced character. Rather, they want us to, again, see him as a monster, as a man who saw the inevitable end of his world and became an inevitability himself. There's no reasoning with a tyrant who'd kill anyone in his path and capture an innocent girl in the pursuit of saving his species, so the game wastes no time attempting to do so, and instead continues to drive home the point that he's more of a monster than a true villain. Just as the griffin we encounter in the prologue reacts to the death of its mate by attacking the villagers of White Orchard, so too are Eredin's actions a direct response to his circumstances. We also learn how Eredin rose to power in the first place. He ascended the throne after killing the previous Elven king, a man beloved by Gels, the administrator he's tasked with caring for his world while he's out hunting rabbits. Super special princesses. With the help of Oniromancer Corrine Tilly, one of the game's more underrated characters if you ask me, Geralt and Avallac'h show Gels proof of Eredin's treason, a sight that convinces Gels to turn on the King of the Wild Hunt. Gels promises not to send reinforcements to Eredin's aid, a defection that makes him incredibly vulnerable. On the surface, this quest line, with its trek through dying and abandoned realms and elven politics, might seem like an additional attempt to make him a nuanced character. And while it does provide some necessary background information, I'd again argue that it really only reinforces his monster-like characterization. The entire reason that Geralt exists is because Eredin needs someone to handle all the boring parts of leadership, the things he can't be bothered to do because he's too busy realm hopping on a ship made of fingernails. If we had seen the King of the Wild Hunt sitting on his throne, listening to courtiers, or dealing with the concerns of the elves who are on the brink of losing their world, then it might make him a more complex figure. But instead, we meet the guy who Eredin has delegated all of those responsibilities to. Eredin has no social graces, no true leadership skills beyond his ability to intimidate. Once more, even in a sequence where he doesn't appear in the flesh, CD Projekt Red is presenting him as an inevitability. This is true even when you consider Geralt's bond with the former king, the one Eredin killed. Typically, after an uprising, even a covert one like this, the first people to head to the chopping block are the loyalists, those who supported or simply admired the previous regime. Geralt is indeed such a person, and no matter how talented he is at being the hand of the king, his appreciation for his predecessor is something Eredin should have considered before handing him the job. But because he's a monster, an emotionless entity hell-bent on his goals, he doesn't understand this, and it proves to be his undoing. Because in the final battle, Geralt abandons him, denying the King of the Wild Hunt the backup he sorely needs. Tempted by the Sunstone, Eredin arrives in Skellige. He lays a trap for Ciri out on the ice, but his forces are quickly met by a formidable but uneasy alliance of Nilfgaardians and Skelligen raiders. Caranthir falls to Ciri's blade, and shortly thereafter, Geralt confronts the King of the Wild Hunt aboard the Naglfar. Before the White Wolf arrives, however, Croc on Crate meets his end on Eredin's blade. As a longtime fan of the series, it's a gut-wrenching moment. Croc is an important character in the books, and his appearances in The Witcher 3, alongside his children Hjalmar and Cerys, are spectacular. He goes out like a badass, refusing to surrender to the game's big bad. But it still hurts to see him go out like this at all. And that's exactly the point. After characterizing Eredin as a monster for the majority of the game, the developers needed a way to make the final battle personal, to give us an extra bit of motivation to want to kill this fucking guy. If you've watched my other videos, you know how much emphasis I put on boss fights, especially final ones, and I think we can all agree that the most successful of these almost always have a personal element to them. Sekiro vs Genichiro and Ishin, Solid Snake versus Liquid Ocelot, multiple incarnations of Link against Ganon. So it was only logical for CD Projekt Red to try and instill some extra passion to this one through the death of Croc. But unfortunately, even with the added motivation, our final duel with Eredin is somewhat lackluster. Some folks have called it disappointing, and I'll give you that, but it's certainly not bad. He has some cool moves, and the realm hopping bits are a nice touch, but even on higher difficulties, he's just not much of a challenge, and our battle with him will ultimately be eclipsed by the puzzle-based challenge of wits with Gaunter Dim, and the bloodbath with Dietlof in Toussaint. All of this is heightened by the fact that the game barely lingers on Eredin's defeat. After Geralt struck the killing blow, Eredin claims that Avallac'h has tricked them both, at which point the White Wolf rushes off to see what's become of Ciri. And thus, the King of the Wild Hunt dies aboard his flagship, with nary a whisper. Because he's not a true antagonist, he's a monster. And once a Witcher's slain their target, all that remains is to heal their wounds, take a trophy from the corpse, and collect the coin. They don't reflect, they just move on, as we do here with Eredin. Overall, though I've leveled a fair bit of criticism at Eredin throughout this video, it's more in the interest of being an honest analyst than anything else. I loved The Witcher 3. In my opinion, it is the greatest video game of all time, and boasts the highest grade of any game I've played since I started ranking them back in 2022. And though I generally approach most of my essays from a restorative perspective, trying to paint the methodology of just about any developer from a positive light, I can't lie to you guys. Eredin is far from a villain to write home about. But that's okay, because in spite of the fact that its primary antagonist is not one of its strong points, The Witcher 3 remains a classic, a game that transformed the open world genre and set the bar for all medieval fantasy RPGs that would follow. We could sit here for hours and talk about the things they could have done with Eredin. My biggest suggestion would have been working him into Novigrad and Skellige, like when he tortured Hendrik in Velen. But honestly, if CD Projekt Red had done this, would The Witcher 3 be any better? If Eredin's motives had been better depicted, if he'd been portrayed sympathetically in the same vein as the Bloody Baron, would the journey of Geralt and Ciri be any more beloved than it already is? I don't think so. It's pretty clear to me, upon review, that early on, the developers likely did envision a version of the King of the Wild Hunt that was more of an active character, as evidenced by his aforementioned actions in Heatherton. But as production went along, it seems that they shied away from this portrayal in favor of making him an inevitable, cold, unfeeling entity that acts on instinct. And ultimately, this was probably the right thing to do. He still accomplishes his narrative goal, which is to force Geralt to come of age right along with Ciri, to learn how to be a better father, to start supporting his adopted daughter rather than parenting her. Eredin isn't going to make anyone's best video game villains of the decades list, but his attacks on the White Wolf and the ashen-haired girl constantly facilitate that growth. Whether it's after the Battle of Kaer Morhen, when Geralt can cheer her up with a simple snowball fight, or following their final confrontation where he must accept that she's old enough to make her own decisions. If, when it's all said and done, The Witcher 3 is about a monster hunter learning this age-old lesson, then naturally, the big bad should be a monster hell-bent on ripping all of that away from him, emotionless and implacable in his determination to stop all of that growth right before it begins. A monster who pursues this goal instinctively, with the same zeal as a lesser vampire might stalk the quiet city streets at night in search of blood. In Eredin's case, he always had more in common with the creatures Geralt takes contracts on than any of his contemporaries. And just like those wonderful side quests, the real highlight is never about the creature Geralt is forced to slay, but the stories told along the path. The tales of love, hate, and regret that tap into the beautiful cocktail of emotions we humans experience every single day. Which makes him not the antagonist of The Witcher 3, but the true monster at the heart of the game. So far in this series, we've taken a look at one of The Witcher 3's best written characters in the Bloody Baron, followed by 3 villains, Emhyr, the Crones, and now Eredin. I have every intention of looking at other antagonists down the line. I have a lot to say about Gaunter O'Dim and Dietlof in particular, but I have yet to replay Hearts of Stone and Blood and Wine on the remaster, so unfortunately I don't have enough gameplay footage to make essays on them just yet. And with Shadow of the Erdtree around the corner and a ballooning to playlist, including a long-planned replay of the entire Dragon Age series in preparation for Veilguard, Alan Wake 2, Spider-Man 2, and the director's cut of Death Stranding, I'm not sure when I will. Plus, EA Sports College Football releases in July, and I'm a big sports fan, so I'm going to have to take a look at that too. So instead, we're going to shift gears and begin looking at Geralt's friends and allies, starting with one of CD Projekt Red's original creations, the man who constantly brings the White Wolf back into politics, Vernon Roche. Thanks for watching. Huge thanks to all 4 members of the Witcher Avengers squad for providing music for this essay, including Farewellion, Ellen Storm, Vintech, and Sheonator Pazik. To check out all 4 of these amazing musicians, just follow the link down below in the description box. Big thanks to all of my Silver and Gold tier Patreon subscribers and YouTube channel members, including James Pruitt, Corey Matson, Gustavo Balabi, Little Caesar, Reed, and Pathonian, who get early access to these videos thanks to donations of $5 to $10 a month. See you guys next time!